It's hard to say the term survival horror and not immediately think of Resident Evil or Silent Hill, or maybe even a deep cut like Alone in the Dark. Franchises like these are popular for a reason, but they often overshadow some of the most formative and most fascinating examples of survival horror design philosophy before it really formally bore the name. But there was this fertile period of creativity in the space between Alone in the Dark's popular but understated arrival in 1992 and the explosion of Resident Evil into the mainstream in 1996, especially in the years of 1994 and 1995. Unfortunately, many games from those years have fallen almost completely through the cracks of history. We often remember Clock Tower from that year, as I did for my Halloween 2025 video, but I bet most of you haven't heard of weirdo titles like Dr. Hauzer, Ecstatica, or Bioforge. And if you haven't, let's change that starting right now. Now, some might argue that these games are probably forgotten for good reason, or that they're missing some key ingredients to actually be considered survival horror, but I'm a big believer in surveying the whole landscape, so let's see for ourselves, shall we? Let's get a little wiser today by traveling back into that messy time of iteration upon Alone in the Dark, before the refinement of Resident Evil clones took the world by storm. Let's meet Evil's previous tenants, the last pioneers of this frightful frontier before the survival horror landscape would change forever. All told, Alone in the Dark in 1992 was a breath of fresh air, despite the fact that Jeff Tunnell's Project Firestart in 1989 had arguably done most everything Alone did already, what with its fixed camera angles, 2.5D static backgrounds, and deliberate control schemes. Alone's attention to tension and the pacing of its quaint, Lovecraftian setting was brought to life by its innovative 3D polygonal models, and all of this together granted a certain je ne sais quoi that compelled critics and average gamers alike to move to the edge of their seats like never before. It didn't start a revolution per se, but it started a movement away from mere adventure games into something more frantic and sensorily fulfilling. And like any other time that success is found, imitators are sure to follow. And if imitation is flattery, they consider Japanese developers River Hill Soft unashamed suck-ups, because they teamed up with publisher Panasonic to go all in on making an Alone in the Dark style experience with their own spin. Like Alone in the Dark, Dr. Hauser is a survival-oriented adventure set in an unnerving mansion with a dark secret within. The game is set in 1952, and you play as reporter Adams Adler, who's on the hunt for his frequent interviewee in the eccentric Dr. Hauser, who's gone missing, and whom Adler has tracked down to this mansion. You don't find any monsters within like Alone in the Dark, but you do find a large variety of puzzles and death traps which require careful attention and often a bit of luck to avoid the first time without knowing they're there or where the switches to turn them off are located. Not much is known about the River Hill Soft team at the time of this game's development, but notably, the game's programmer is Akihiro Ino, known for co-founding Level 5, the studio behind such series as Professor Layton. He joined River Hill Soft early in his career and saw an opportunity to seize the momentum of the burgeoning 3D graphics movement and make a truly 3D game for the relevantly named 3DO Interactive Multiplayer Console, or the 3DO, and that game became Dr. Hauser. Now, whereas Alone in the Dark had 3D models playing atop 2D backgrounds, there was no hiding the fact that Dr. Hauser was fully three-dimensional, as you could play the game from a fixed camera perspective, or you could switch to first person or an overhead view, which is an impressive array of options for the time. Now, I don't know why you need all these different options, but I think River Hill Soft was just really proud of what they pulled off, and I can see why. True 3D and texture map surfaces were quite rare back then, so I guess I'd go ham too. River Hill Soft also liked to zoom in on Adler's very expressive face as he reacts to all the weird goings on here. That said, this is a lot of tech signifying not much of anything else. If the music wasn't absolutely fantastically creepy, this would be one of the most tame survival adventure games just about ever made. You go around clicking on furniture and other things to find keys and various other items like a lighter or a can of fuel or dynamite or what have you, and they're all relatively easy to discern what they'll go to eventually. Its puzzles are the least of your worries. Trial and erroring your way through all the traps is what separates the men from the boys here. Falling chandeliers, spiked traps, swinging axes, trapdoors in the floor, Indiana Jones-esque boulders, poison darts, you name it. Adler's got to evade it, but you'll probably die quite a few times trying to figure out how. Get used to a lot of this sound. But there are no monsters, as we said, no scary scenes of carnage, despite what the notes that you pick up imply is happening here. So the heavy lifting is often done by pushing heavy things like a clock or a table into a hole to solve a puzzle. And no, I don't mean to break something at the bottom or jar something loose or just get it out of the way. I mean somehow a huge table just drops cleanly into the gap and stays there indefinitely. Gravity is just a suggestion, guys. Noticeably, you'll also have to cycle through your inventory, and it's in order of what you picked up, so the last thing you picked up is often what you need, so you'll have to scroll all the way to the end every time you want to pick something out and insert it somewhere. Yippee! Here's where you'll also need to read the notes and journals that you pick up, which brings us to the absolutely wacky story. So Dr. Hauzer is a bit of a Renaissance man, and he often did archaeological digs and found ancient artifacts. Turns out he's at it again, even to the point of neglecting his dying wife. Now, why he's so obsessive about all of this is never quite clear, but he doubles down when he realizes that the cursed lithograph of a cherub can actually lead him to the Garden of Eden, and thus eternal life, which is what the writers thought that the tree in the garden granted, not simply the knowledge of good and evil. But then they also called cherubs deities, which doesn't make much sense, as deities are gods, and cherubs are just angels subservient to God, so... What? Let's just say you won't be playing this game for its biblically accurate angels or much of anything else, but hey, I get it. The Bible is just one of those complicated books like we find in the library. Religious quibbles aside, Dr. Hauzer's journal continues that his excavation team actually broke an artifact and angered the master, whoever that is, and he worries that he'll have to make it up to him, so he plans to kill all of his workers once their work is finished so he can ingratiate himself back to this master and hopefully give him some of that eternal life. Now, as whacked out as this patchwork Bible folklore is, it's definitely fun to read, and it carries a heavy load alongside the music to make this game feel ominous. The mansion's bright lighting and very unremarkable, often plain interiors give absolutely zero signs of this excavation work being done, or any real scary ambiance. But that'll all change soon as we use our lighter and dynamite to blow up a wall and enter the final sanctum of Dr. Hauzer. Within, we finally see some wall carvings and hieroglyphics and get a real sense of this place's ancient history. Dr. Hauzer is here, but also not here, as he's enshrined in this kind of blue sculpture thing, and the doctor is not feeling well. Physician, heal thyself. He somehow managed to get the cherub to let him into a place that's near God, where everything's eternal, including his life, but he cannot find his wife anywhere. He blames Adler for scaring her off and shoots fireballs at him, which are hard as fuck to dodge. But armed with a picture of his wife that we found, Adler throws it at him, makes him think she's returned, but somehow this makes him go supernova and blow up the whole building, so it's train car time to make our escape. RE4 would be proud. The Hauzer house sinks beneath the earth, and we get a cool pull-away shot as we escape, wondering if all of this really happened. Now, despite the fact that the plot and the environment seem entirely disconnected from one another, like the story was added in later over the play space, there's a certain charm to this game. The Manor's 3D nature and the multiple viewing angles, as well as Adler's very expressive facial animations, are all impressive. And I must say, I love the biblical folklore angle and how unhinged the ending is, even if it doesn't make much sense. Why would Hauzer have to gain eternal life to see his wife who's dead? Couldn't he just die and be with her without all this malarkey? Living eternally means just going to another realm. Wouldn't that just happen regardless if you died or whether you were sent there before that? It doesn't make much sense, but it's not worth troubling our pretty little heads about because Dr. Hauzer's value is how it adds onto Alone in the Dark's accomplishments and pulls off a few of its own. Now, why then is Dr. Hauzer not more popular? Well, though some English fan translations exist, Dr. Hauzer was only ever officially released for the 3DO in Japan. It was also heavily derivative of Alone in the Dark, but cited at the time as having much less atmosphere or scares, which is very obvious by the brightly lit and sparse environments that look real enough, but they never feel ominous. In fact, the music is the only part of the presentation outside of the notes left lying around and the ending scene which have any real drama or tension to them. Otherwise, you're just clicking on every piece of furniture inside or pushing it around until it does something, or dying to your empteenth trap. It's like a boring Home Alone movie, but still, the game has some intangible quality to it. So much so that it inspired Silent Hill and Siren director Keiichiro Toyama to get into game development in the first place. Toyama had never liked gore or slashers, but Dr. Hauzer's indirect dangers and sense of psychological fear was creative space that he could riff on and make a much more slow burn kind of experience that suited his tastes. So that's a pretty good legacy to leave behind, wouldn't you say? I guess that's what's up, Doc.
Oh no.
The next game on our list is also indebted to Alone in the Dark, but unlike Dr. Hauzer, which really only innovated on a technical level, this one manages to make great strides in storytelling and world design, and even mechanics. Ecstatica, or Ecstatica: A State of Mind as it's sometimes called, was developed primarily by Andrew Spencer of Andrew Spencer Studios and published by Psygnosis. This proved to be a meeting of similar minds, because Spencer was something of an eccentric, as Ecstatica proves, and Psygnosis was no stranger to backing weird, creative projects graphics other publishers might pass on, like Lemmings or Shadow of the Beast. Spencer was quite the talent. As many of these stories tend to go, Spencer started out in his visible professional career making sports games on the Commodore 64, like International Soccer, International Basketball, and Street Sports Basketball, before he turned heel like the characters in Ecstatica and started making his pet project. It would take him 5 years to complete, and he needs some help from French animator Alain Mondron and others by development's end. But as these things go, Ecstatica is clearly the work of a singular vision, a clever tension between a clever tension between gory horror and decidedly British humor that's as wacky as it is bawdy. Mondron's background working for Disney and using circle-based sketching techniques made for quite an easy transition to Spencer's proprietary engine based around ellipsoid graphics. Not only did Mondron not have to know much of any coding, he could very easily make the characters expressive in their movements, lending the game remarkable realism but also tons of flexibility when it came to the game's many gags. As many articles have joked, Ecstatica was the groundbreaking survival horror game it was because it had a lot of balls. So not only did the graphics look a lot more naturalistic than Alone in the Dark's jagged edges, they also, according to Joystuck, had the advantage of being easier on processing power than traditional polygons. So say hello to bubble butts and bubble dicks. But this plays right into the tone and puerile humor that the devs were going for, all of which we'll get into here in just a sec. Ecstatica's story begins in the British countryside in the year 928, and while many incorrectly call this medieval, a period that started around the late 5th century, the game does feature a lot of what we think when it comes to medieval times.
This is medieval times!
There's a ton of wooded areas and castles, an emphasis on Christianity versus paganism, and a lot of swords and sorcery supernaturalism. I wouldn't have it any other way. You can choose to be a man or a woman at the beginning, just like Alone in the Dark that you choose between Emily Hartwood or Edward Carnby, and you'll play in third person with fixed camera angles that change as you move through the environments, which are somewhere in between 2 and 3D. On its face, your character feels quite a bit like Edward Carnby. He moves gingerly and can sprint as needed, and if he dies, he'll clutch his guts and groan just like him. But Ecstatica has way more tricks up its sleeve. You can sneak, and you can also hide in select areas. Combat also lets you dodge blows and then counterpunch. Now this all sounds pretty good in theory and was pretty impressive for the time, but how it actually plays is kind of atrocious in the year of our Lord 2026. The animations just feel like you're flailing, and I tended to miss a lot of strikes that seem to go right through enemies, many of whom are stalker enemies that hunt you almost relentlessly and seem to be able to stun lock you to death on the regular when you're just trying to explore and get your bearings. I wish it were more obvious where you can hide too, because I only found one place behind these barrels to do so. Still, the fact that the game had this many features of modern games back in 1994 is pretty astounding. Ecstatica is also quite the level up moment for storytelling and immersion.
Do not approach me, you!
Characters are fully voice acted, and there are many in-engine cutscenes that don't require the player's input, but which are seamlessly transitioned to and from. Ecstatica lacks any UI or inventory to take you out of the game either. Your character's health can get low from repeated damage, and you'll hold your arm to note your falling health, but you can also heal up if out of combat for long enough, which is a cool touch, and something that we wouldn't see again feature so prominently until games like Halo with its shield system, Call of Duty's regenerating health system, or the on-screen UI of Dead Space. The game is also quite funny, with fourth wall breaks all over the place, peeing statues or just your character peeing. Quite a lot of peeing, actually. And even goofy scenes of the demons here gloating over your death in the game over screen, a much funnier take on the post-death scene that Alone in the Dark had. Funnily enough, or not funny, is how much people apparently were alarmed by this level of flippant gore and nudity, earning the game an 18 rating, which is the equivalent of a mature or adults-only rating back in the day, something that games didn't get very often from my research. The game features a lot of horrific imagery like an upside-down crucifixion, a woman impaled with a spear, or a guy crawling across the ground. It's never scary, just kind of wacky and kind of makes you cringe and want to laugh in response to it. Make yourself feel a little bit more comfortable. And then there's weird stuff like how Jesus is always hanging crucified while wearing no pants, which is something I never needed to see. Then there's dead lady boobies or these naked executioner looking dudes with their little erect ellipsoids because, why not? Rated 18 for a reason, I suppose. But by the same token, there's other weird details that are actually really cool, like being able to take armor off the wall, which you can put on, which makes you resistant to damage, but also super slow. It's kind of a death sentence, but it's there. And while Ecstatica can be a bit of a bitch to navigate as the roaming monsters can kill you very easily and you can only hold one item at a time, if you can brave this trial and error tempest, you'll get to the good parts of the game, which are these fantastical scenes in the castle, and surprisingly explicit diagrams for how puzzles are to be solved, or the incidental tips that NPCs give you to progress. like this drunk guy you save or a reanimated skeleton that tell you what you needed to do. There's this almost Hellboy level of folksy fairy tale cleverness to the whole thing. Speaking of fairy tales, let's talk about the tale itself, which is pretty nifty. The story's a fair bit like Zelda if she were possessing Silent Hill like Alessa Gillespie does. The lore is that the witch Ecstatica has summoned a demon and has essentially gotten loose and unleashed all the monsters that we see roaming around. Nearby, there's a monastery full of devout monks who are worried about all the pagan goings-on and how the castle has been compromised by the witch within, or how they've kept the Lady of the Lake at bay by giving her a sword, which they're not proud of but seems to be working pretty well. You even eventually get to meet up with this lady and get knighted yourself. Holy shit, you can steal a sacred bone off an altar here and get in major trouble with the monks, which is a cool reactive piece of story. Getting chased by this very horny lady while on a broken down flying broom has to be one of the weirdest and most amusing things I've ever seen in a game. But that's nothing compared to how the bone we brought with us is actually highly desired by the actual factual devil, whom we can make a deal with or tell him, "Get behind me, Satan." If we accept his offer, we are fanned down by the BDSM boys with the palms on their palms. If that's not your scene, you can resist, and the devil either turns into a dragon or attacks us with a dragon. I can't really tell, but regardless, once you slay the dragon, the damsel Ecstatica will embrace us, and we ride off across the non-existent bridge to live happily ever after and stuff. It's a pretty fun little tale overall, and the characters are vibrantly voice acted and the environments are lush and beautiful. The animations and the cutscenes are deliciously wacky and slapstick, and the game is honestly just ceaselessly funny. My only problem is actually playing the game. There are certain very gracious instances of the game telling you exactly what you need, like the standing stone saying you need 2 items here or nothing will happen, but actually finding all these little bits and pieces and then knowing what these little pixels even represent, much less than what they go to, and where in the game they'll fit is a conundrum in and of itself many times. Just exploring is a nightmare. The 2 stalker enemies and the werewolf and the minotaur are 2 of my favorite mythological creatures that I was happy to see, except in the context of this game, where they were egregious to contend with, and you can really fuck up your playthrough if you happen to go into all the places that trigger their appearances in quick succession, making them essentially unescapable. The footage I used for much of this review is actually from someone who knows this game inside and out, and you can tell that they know which route to go through the game to not trigger them so often. But going in blind is a nightmare, and honestly, I don't know why that's a problem anybody should have to put up with. Part of that frustration is because hiding places are slim, the bad guys run pretty fast, and it's really easy to have the AI either dominate you with how aggressive they attack you, or, like you see here when this pro dude plays it, constantly wait for an opening. So, lucky you. Maybe it's possible that these problems have something to do with DOSBox, where maybe upping the cycles or something makes certain AI behaviors upgrade or make them harder to contend with. I don't know. But this game sure has that kind of King's Field of third-person games feel at times.
Can't work every time, I suppose.
But my frustrations aside, it's easy to be impressed by the sheer level of explicit storytelling, the in-engine cutscenes that don't do black bars or use a black screen to load in, and how the action is immediate and lacks the intrusion of UI that might take you out of the experience more. The game's a bit too trial and error, as many games were back then, but I'd have to recommend that survival horror fans go back and try this deliciously creative and wacky entry into a genre that had yet to truly find its footing, but was falling upwards even when it stumbled. So with that, 1994 is in the books when it comes to proto-survival horror, and now we're on to 1995, the year before the boom. And that brings us to the year that Hifumi Kono and friends cooked up the formative clock tower that revolved around the iconic Stalker, Enemy, and Scissorman that Capcom likely drew from in creating Mr. X and Nemesis in Resident Evil 2 and 3. And while that's an important line of influence, if indeed it is a line that actually exists, it's a known quantity in the general zeitgeist, whereas Bioforge, the other game from 1995, is not. That's a shame. Bioforge is the third-person sci-fi survival horror type experience set in third person, I already said that, with fixed camera angles and 2D backgrounds that highly resemble a classic point-and-click adventure, and the game has a truly elaborate take on tank controls. Now, it's probably the least horrific game on this list in terms of outright fear, but it is full of tough encounters and is heavy on existential and body horror in much the same way that Quake 4 is. There's no clear through line between this and later survival horror games, but it's worth mentioning because it is fairly obscure and, like Ecstatica, is quite a different take on the types of scenarios that Alone in the Dark and other survival horror adjacent experiences typically traffic in. BioWare.
What are you talking about?
Bioforge was developed for the MS-DOS by Origin Systems, the legendary studio behind the Ultima and Wing Commander series, and which also published and provided some dev support for Looking Glass on their Ultima Underworld 1 and 2 games, as well as the first System Shock. Now, the System Shock connection is pretty important because if I had to describe Bioforge, it's what if we did a Resident Evil game inside of a System Shock world? Tons of cyborgs and big robots and battery-powered health systems, copious notes to pick up and read about the history of this brutal world, which is a vibe, let me tell you. Lord British himself, Richard Garriott, would be the game's executive producer, though his involvement beyond this title has got no specifics. This project was much more the passion project of writer Jack Herman and the game's director Ken Demarest. Despite the outrageous success of Ultima 7 The Black Gate, Demarest felt that the game was almost too wide open, and thought it would be more immersive to make a more intentionally guided and cinematic experience. Bioforge's working title at one point was Interactive Movie 1. Interactive movie was a term that got thrown around a lot back then with the FMV craze. Bioforge sought to bridge the gap between the games that tried to be immersive by just putting actors on screen. Bioforge did everything in engine, creating lifelike 3D animations for the characters using pose, interpolation, and other advanced techniques that would become the mainstay of video games thereafter. And while the backgrounds were beautifully rendered static 2D images, there were a lot of smart tricks that gave the world the illusion of depth and texture, like being able to bounce lasers blast off walls and into enemies around the corner. But there's no more impressive a technical feat than the player character himself named Lex. You awake on a distant alien moon as a cyborg who's just been turned into this creature by Dr. Mastaba, one of the cult-like group of Mondites who thinks it's a holy calling to meld technology and mankind to make the ultimate killing machine. Their aims go so far as to steal alien tech from the race known as the Fix, an act which accidentally awakes one of their otherwise peaceful race into a vengeful rampage that has damaged the reactor and given you limited time to escape. You'll have to solve numerous puzzles and fight a ton of bad guys to get out. Lex controls mostly like Alone in the Dark does, except Lex's animations are much more detailed and he looks much less jagged than Carnby. It's also a lot easier to get him to sprint. Demarest also was keen to try and keep Lex centered in the camera view at all times to avoid things that could happen in specifically Alone in the Dark, where the camera angle could sometimes obscure what you needed to see in order to run or fight back. Thank God Origin saw fit to make this a priority because combat is already a big headache. The way combat works is a bit like System Shock, as you'll have to turn on combat mode, and then to attack, you'll have to hold down the Alt key and then corresponding number pad button to determine which way Lex will attack, combining 4 or 6 with the Alt key or left and right hooks, whereas 1 and 3 are side steps or dodges, X is a double overhand, and 7 and 9 are high attacks. It's quite finicky as tank controls go, and there's also the issue of enemy AI being so erratic that you could miss them because they just sort of wander off mid-fight for no reason. And there's also the problems of either hit detection or depth perception from the camera angles being really weird. They can make fights tougher than they would be if the design was a little less hostile to player perception. You're given 3 difficulty options upon starting up the game, and you can choose your preference with your character's robotic hand as a cursor, which is a cool little touch, literally. I would definitely advise you to play on easy because the game is brutally hard and unforgiving, and enemies are already so spongy that it doesn't add anything but tedium. It's hard enough to line up hits, and it's easy to get clipped and make it very hard to progress because if you take enough damage, you'll develop a limp. That means you'll fall over if you sprint, which can be a death sentence when trying to get around the corridor-wide robot that can kill you in 2 hits, and already requires an obscure sidestep cheese tack to get past otherwise. There are a lot of ways to lock yourself out of progression, and not just because the game will let you leave areas that you can't return to without getting every progression item you needed, but also because you can simply be too battered to do basic things like running away or fighting properly. It's a tough system to endure, and I bet a fair few people had to restart this one back in the day because of how poorly enough encounters had gone in a row. But while Bioforge can sometimes force you into a lot of boring and repetitive boss fights that can just beat you to tar, Origin also has an eye for crafting these immersive sim-style alternative strategies that, if you notice that they're there and available, can keep you out of harm's way. Take for instance the very first NPC that you can either beat down to get the fork in his cell to unlock the nearby door. Yeah, I don't know how that works either. Or you can pick up the piece of meat in your cell and throw it on the ground to distract him so you can take what you need and leave in peace. Later on, you meet another unfortunate cyborg candidate named Dane, and you can choose to end his misery so he doesn't get strogified, or you can leave him to suffer. Mercy killing him actually nets you his battery that you can use to regain health, so it's also in your best interest to be on your best behavior. Or you can just simply roleplay whichever personality you think is appropriate for Lex's situation, whether to be an avenging angel or someone who chooses to help those he meets that are suffering like he is. The game's emphasis on voice acting goes a long way to making this feel personal and cinematic, and it's unlike anything except perhaps Ecstatica that has as much modern sensibility in its cinematic storytelling.
I hope Mastaba rewards your loyalty by making you his next test subject.
Your enemies will taunt you in battle. There are cutscenes with characters like Dr. Mastaba that contextualize the situation, and there are long notes to read that detail a lot of background lore about the Mondites' sick plans, how the prisoners here have fared, and some background on the alien fix that they've been purloining tech from. There are also some really cool details like incidental quakes that'll shake your screen that happen because the moon's reactor is destabilizing the ground beneath your feet. It doesn't do anything to you, but it feels like something's happening to you. And the fact that it happens at seemingly random times just make it seem all the more incidental and real. The way puzzles are solved is also quite visually pleasing and creative. You get to use that cyborg hand cursor to click through diegetic menus and can remote control robots to tactily aid your puzzle solving, like how going into a computer can tell a cleaning robot to pick up that severed arm from the blue guy earlier, whom you either killed or distracted, and you can bring it to the touchpad across the room so you can verify the fingerprint by typing in this guy's credentials on the console, opening the way forward, kind of like how a bank vault works when you open it. The rest of the puzzles are a bit out there and they require some very trial and error logic to understand what the game wants, like fighting this Robo-Raptor and dropping him down a hole where some unforeseen monster awaits, freezing them both with the hole open, and then being able to descend freely. But further on, there are 3 forks in the road, 2 of which are instant death traps, only one of which is obviously so. These kind of fuck you moments, if you just happen to choose wrongly, means you'll be save scumming like mad anytime the slightest progress is made so as to avoid having your time wasted. But let's not dwell on the funk for long. But there's all sorts of cool little details, like the tube that we travel through at high speeds or the reactor that's crackling with energy. Or how we can draw the bad guy across this energy bridge and then turn it off while he's above it so he'll fall to his death. In another section, we have to entice this giant lizard into range of our missiles before we can light him up. I also love how Lex can beat this guy up to make him activate the turrets so that we can use them to shoot down some ships in the sky, or how we can get an envirosuit that lets us get into the reactor System Shock style. That's to say nothing of the alien cube we find that lets us fly between platforms, or the alien emissary that speaks to us later on, or the sweet cloaking suit that makes us impervious to damage so we can make a break for it and escape this dying moon. There was even supposed to be a sequel at one point, but this became an expansion which was eventually canned too as Origin was having a tough year, according to Richard Garriott. It's too bad, because you can see how the classic survival horror features of janky controls, dramatic camera angles, involved puzzles and dangerous backtracking, and the general feeling of fighting for your life take on new meaning when put into this otherwise bright and involved sci-fi setup. Add in the cinematic flair of its voice acting and framing and sound and music, and all the cool RPG and immersive sim stuff that you have here to choose from, and you've got yourself a really unique flavor of game. But unfortunately, it, unlike the ship you escape on, never quite took off. And that brings us to the end of today's video. This was both a really fun and really trying video to make because so many of these games were hard as fuck to play and kind of hard to ingratiate yourself to. But it's also hard not to appreciate the creativity. Like, who could forget the spiffy 3 in it? Like, who could forget the fuck me? Like, who could forget the spiffy 3D innovation of Dr. Hauzer, or its wacky plot as the Doctor dug for the entrance to the Garden of Eden so he could be granted eternal life from the cherub that guards its gates, and who could only be defeated by stuffing a picture of his wife in his face. I'm also overjoyed to finally know what Ecstatica was all about, a swords and sorcery style game that's light on the horror perhaps, but all about survival and puzzle solving and immersive world building, with some of the most expressive animations and lively humor that's not afraid to get a little spicy. Couldn't help but be impressed and excited to see what Origin had forged for us with Bioforge, a game that tried to innovate upon Alone in the Dark's fixed camera angles and static backgrounds and combat, with some mixed but ultimately fascinating results. It's at this point that the only other franchise of note that I'm aware of that we could still talk about is Clock Tower, which I recently released a full-on review of for Halloween 2025 that, 5 or 6 people watched, so hey, go be the 6th. I kid, but also kind of not. Now don't worry, I'll still get to the rest of Clock Tower and Fatal Frame and Sired and Parasite Eve and, etc. someday, but not before getting to the main event that I've been gearing up for these past couple videos. With the landscape of pre-Resident Evil gaming properly surveyed, I can now finally enter the world of survival horror for the very first time. I can't wait. Big shout out to my patrons Mark Neubauer, Deadforge, Hey Blondie, Bibi F. and Bloxburg, Melancholy Geek, and Luke Dudney, and a special shout out to James Wyatt and the Nth Review for supporting me through my highest tier. Thanks. Now if you want to join these guys in supporting me, now is actually the best time. In addition to getting shouted out at the end of videos like this, and getting early access to whatever's coming out next, I'm dropping additional written reviews on Patreon of games, movies, and TV shows, and we have just started doing a monthly Q&A where you can ask me anything you want, and I'll answer. Alright guys, well, If you would like to ask some questions, get on that Patreon and get access to all the perks. That's all for me. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. God bless.